Okay, so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So a couple of times this year I've attempted to do some You Choose My TBR videos, and the rereads just haven't really been working out for me. But what I always loved about doing them, and then loved watching back afterwards, was taking a look back to what I was reading that time a year ago. So I thought, why not just take out the voting element where you guys get the opportunity to pick something for me to reread, and we still just look back anyway at what I read then and what I'm thinking about it now a year later. So let's take a look back at what I read in August of 2020. The first book that I read this month was The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. This is a YA historical fiction, and it follows a girl whose name is Liesel. Shout out to the Sound of Music. Liesel is put up for adoption, or well, not put up for adoption, she's given to a family by her mother. So let me explain. The setting of this book is that it's set in World War II, and Liesel and her mother are Jewish. Liesel's mother believes that Liesel will have a much better life if she's raised by two parents that are not Jewish, so she hands Liesel over to these two non-Jewish people. This book follows Liesel's life. The interesting thing about this book is that it is narrated by the one and only Death. However, if you are planning on picking up this book purely for the sake that it is narrated by Death, stop, wait, heed my warning. I did that. I picked up this book knowing nothing about it purely for the sake that it was narrated by Death, and that's it. And I walked away incredibly disappointed. The Book Thief. I don't have this book anymore. I actually unhauled it. So I thought that this would be very interesting to read from the perspective of Death, and I went in for definitely the wrong reasons, and I worked that out pretty quickly. I just checked, I gave it 2 stars, and that doesn't surprise me. My rating was definitely affected by the fact that I was not enjoying reading this book because I wanted to read it because it was narrated by from the perspective of Death. And that is because, while the first 2 chapters are done incredibly well, and if you ever want to see a book narrated by Death, just read the first 2 chapters, the remainder of the book, you can easily forget that Death is narrating it at all, because it just sounds like standard, normal narration. The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So this is an adult dark fantasy book that follows a man who goes back to his childhood home, and while he is there, he regresses back into a memory of his childhood when he was 10 years old. For me, the first half of this book reads more like a contemporary. The second half of this book is where the dark adult fantasy comes into play. Now, I also want to say that I don't feel that this book is an adult fantasy. It is marketed as an adult dark fantasy, but aside from one little paragraph that happens around about the halfway mark in this book that involves a father and son dynamic, that could be depicted as an adult scene. It's very short though, and if you blink you miss it, but the rest of it to me reads more as YA. Gave this book a total of 4 stars. I highly recommend this book to anyone who loves Coraline, because as I said, this book kind of reads along the same vein. Trigger warning, drowning. The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman is a book that I have hung on to, although I have ummed and ahed a lot about whether or not to unhaul this book. As far as judging the book on its own merits, I think that the book was okay. It took me a little while to get into, but once we got into the fantastical elements, I did rather enjoy my ride with it, so I ended up giving it 4 stars. I think that rating would still hold up to this day. Bloodlines by Rochelle Mead. This is the first book in the spin-off series to the Vampire Academy series. So, I picked up this book after DNFing Nevernight, and I'm really happy that I did. I had this book just lying around my home. I purchased it a long time ago, but never read it. And I loved how Vampire Academy ended so much that I couldn't wait to keep reading, even if it was a spin-off. For those of you who have read Vampire Academy, this book follows 3 of those characters quite closely. Sydney Sage, Adrian Ivashkov, and Jill Mastrano. I want to give a very high recommendation. If you have not... Okay, let's not knock our bookshelf, Mr. Francy. If you have not read the Vampire Academy series, I highly recommend you read that first, because this book is a whole pile of spoilers when it comes to that series. So definitely I highly recommend either reading that series first or knowing you are going to be spoiled for that series when you go into this one. On entertainment level and does it fit the brief, I gave this book 5 stars. Bloodlines by Rochelle Mead. I have unhauled this book. I really enjoyed this first book. Unfortunately, I did not enjoy the second one, so I ended up DNFing the series as a whole, but I did enjoy this first book. The 4th book that I read this month was The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is a Middle Eastern mythological fantasy. It is YA, and it is a dual perspective book that follows 2 different characters, Nahri and Ali. Nahri's perspective has been described as bad romancy before, and I completely agree, so I'm just going to go with that description, bad romancy. Meanwhile, we have Ali. The premise of this book is that with Nahri is a swindler / fake fortune teller who makes her money by swindling people. One day she ends up summoning a jinn, or as we call it, a genie, and things happen from there that show us that there is more to Nahri than meets the eye. As for Ali's perspective, Ali is a prince, as I've already said, and Ali doesn't appreciate the way that the culture is and the laws are where he lives. I probably would give this a 2-star on entertainment level alone. So in total, I gave this book 3 stars. The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. Yes, this is the only author's name that I pronounce as technically professionally as I can, because I just love the sound of her name. Chakraborty. I thought this book was okay. I really enjoyed Ali's perspective. I did not enjoy Nahri's perspective. You guys, I ummed and ahed so many times about unhauling this book, but what stopped me was how beautiful this book is. And just take a moment to drink that in. Gorgeous, gorgeous cover. The next book that I picked up was Infinity Sun by Adam Silvera. Okay, let's talk about this book. This is a YA fantasy, and I gave this book 2 stars. Okay. I did not like this book, and I was saddened by that because I wanted to love Adam Silvera. I don't feel this book completely fits the brief. While there are certain fantastical elements, they are very few and far between. This book to me reads like a contemporary that has a small sprinkling of fantasy placed in there, and it just didn't grab my attention. Also, from the blurb, to me, the premise of the book kind of read as 2 brothers, both who receive power. One who wants to use his powers for good, and the other who wants to use his powers for evil. Will this be an ultimate battle to the death? It was nothing like that. I was incredibly disappointed by this book. I gave it 2 stars. Infinity Sun by Adam Silvera. This is one of 2 Adam Silvera fantasy books that exist out there. Recently, I did an LGBTIQ+ books recommendations for you guys, and Adam Silvera heavily featured in them. He writes LGBTIQ+ male romance contemporary books as well as fantasy books. I read Infinity Sun, his fantasy book, before I read his LGBTIQ+ stuff. I did not enjoy his fantasy read. It just really did not appeal to me at all. I ended up giving it 2 stars, so not surprisingly I have unhauled it, but of course I've hung on to his LGBTIQ+ stuff. The next book that I read couldn't have gone any better for me. It was The Gravity of Us by Phil Stamper. This is a YA contemporary LGBTIQ+ male romance book. Okay, that was a lot to say. We're going to call this a YA contemporary. Okay, so this book follows Cal Jr., his father, Cal Sr., and his mother. One day, Cal Sr. is called to be told that he is going to be part of an apprenticeship for NASA, which means that the 3 members of that family need to pack up their lives. Anyway, meanwhile, Cal Jr. is a teenager who is an aspiring journalist, so much so that he has created a ton of social media platforms. He has a massive following, and he reports hard-hitting news to them. He has done so well as a teenager that BuzzFeed have even offered to give him an internship to give him a foot in the door. But when Cal Sr. packs up his life and has him shipped off with them to Texas, all of that seems to go right down the drain. When Cal Jr. gets to the training center, he meets another boy whose name is Leon. These two start to get to know each other and slowly form a relationship. I highly, highly, highly recommend this book. And every time I hold this book, I say the same thing, so I'm going to say it again here. Phil Stamper has another book coming out in February of 2021. By any chance, Phil Stamper, if you're watching and you want to send me an arc of that book, I will gladly read it and review it. And if Phil Stamper doesn't send me an arc of that book, I'm still going to purchase it anyway, because I love this and I trust Phil Stamper so much after reading this book. He is amazing. I highly recommend you pick this book up. Oh my gosh, you guys, this was definitely not planned. It just worked out that way. If you want to know how much I love The Gravity of Us, just look behind me. It's being displayed. It's one of my 3 books that you can see that have the cover facing out. That's how much I love it. So I'm going to grab it down off the shelf and we'll display just Phil Stamper's other book, As Far As You'll Take Me, which I liked just as much. The Gravity of Us is a book I spoke about recently. It was part of my LGBTIQ+ recommendations. It came under the tier of being a great starting point. So Phil Stamper does tackle some relatively hard-hitting contemporary topics. So I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's definitely own voices, Phil Stamper being a gay man, and I highly recommend Phil Stamper. I loved this book so much that Phil Stamper became an auto buy for me. Unfortunately, he's only released 2 books so far, so when the next one comes out, you know it's going to be on this channel. But yeah, I absolutely love both of these books. I definitely would recommend starting with The Gravity of Us before going on to As Far As You'll Take Me, but definitely the 5-star rating still holds up to this day.